Greetings, everyone. We're going to be getting started soon. If you would kindly, in the chat area, I believe it's to your right, if you would kindly just chat that you can in fact hear me and see the screen properly, that would be a great help to start with our webinar this evening. So just let me know that you can hear me fine and that you can see the screen fine. And just put that in the chat area, would be greatly appreciated. And we'll be starting in about 2 more minutes. I should mention that this webinar is run on Webinar Jam, and it needs a nice strong bandwidth. So make sure that you are close to a nice strong Wi-Fi signal. At best, if you can plug a direct wire into your computer, that will give you the best result. Or if you are walking around with your computer, try to keep your computer more still or your iPad still so that you won't have too much missing in the Wi-Fi connection. Okay, if you could all again please chat in the area that you can in fact hear me. So I'm going to just send you all a message to see if you can hear me, and you can just respond yes, no, maybe, I can't hear you. And I will wait for your answers before we proceed. Don't be shy. Step up. Let me know if you can in fact hear me. And we are simply testing for sound right now. You should be able to locate the chat area in your window. I believe it's to the right side. Just look for the chat area or wherever you see my message coming up. And you can type right in that area that you can in fact hear and see the webinar. And as soon as I get a yes, no, or maybe, we shall go right forward into the content for the evening. Okay, we're not really getting any response, so this gives me concern that maybe you cannot hear me. So let's try it one more time. Yes, no, or maybe. Yes, I can hear you. Fine. That's all we need, and we will proceed. We might just proceed anyway. All right. So we're going to start this evening by just making a few announcements. And one is, I want to direct you to sexyspirits.com. That's the name of the site that is hosting and providing these webinars, as well as providing the future courses that are coming up. And I'm just going to make you aware of those so that you can take a look. So when you get to sexyspirits.com, you can just press, you can actually scroll down and you can register and subscribe. You can also look at the free events as you see our webinars listed for this evening. And then you can press this little button to the right and get right to all of our events that I'm going to just simply talk about, spend a few minutes talking about. Okay, so as soon as we get to events, what I want to just announce is that this coming, Sunday, September 13th, we have Family Constellations by Roberta Maria Atti. We have these every second Sunday of the month. I would highly recommend that you experience this type of work developed by Bert Hellinger from Germany. He's in his 80s, and I think Family Constellations has given for me the greatest insight on relationships, on family dynamics, and how it plays into who we are today. And I'm going to direct you to a week later. We have a great lecture seminar coming up on Friday, September 18th. It's called Sexual Energy Cultivation Practices for Men and Women. This will be a 3-hour seminar that will be given in New York City. Again, you can go to Sexy Spirits and read all of these. The information and registration link is right there where you can sign up this. And then on Saturday and Sunday, we have a very special workshop for men only. This is the Sexual Energy Cultivation for Men Training and Practice, where we will be going over the full materials of the Taoist basics, along with the sexual energy cultivation practices that were created by celibate monks. And we have on Sunday a special guest, and from 11 to 2, this will be available to both men and women. It is Charlie Glickman. We've had him here before. He is the author of The Ultimate Guide to Prostate Health. And you don't want to miss that. That's going to be Sunday, September 20th. So if you have any questions about these events, you can just always go to Sexy Spirits, and you can view right on that link there all of the things that I've just showed you. So we're going to move on to now the subject of our evening tonight, which is actually our second in series of cultivating sexual energy. And I'm just going to draw up this, let's get this on the screen for us and make sure that we have it working properly. And I'm hoping that that's going to do it. I'll be able to tell. So I'm going to make this available here. And we'll wait just a few minutes until everybody is seeing the cover page to our lecture tonight. It involves Taoist sexual practices. Now, there are two aspects of Taoist sexual practices. There is the solo cultivation and dual cultivation. We will be covering primarily the solo cultivation. And if you were on the webinar that we had last, when we talk about these practices, we refer to them as the art and practice of generating, transforming, and storing sexual energy. That is basically how I would define the formula, the way that it is used in the Taoist practices. My first entry into learning about these Taoist practices were by this book written by Daniel P. Reed called The Tao of Health, Sex, and Longevity. And I just want to read, a small paragraph that's very important to understand before we get into these practices. And it is written as follows: if the mixture of your qi, referring to general vital energy or life force, jing, which is our sexual essence, and shen, which is the spirit, is imbalanced, it will be difficult to unite yourself and feel whole and peaceful. Cultivating sex energy is important in nourishing your spirit, but without proper diet, exercise, meditation, moral behavior, and love, true cultivation is impossible. And the reason why I want to start off with this is because many think that just by learning the physical, sexual parts of it, that they're going to really comprehend these practices. And it's just not true. You will not get the whole picture unless you learn the entire background of how these practices evolved. So when I learned these practices, one of the first things I learned about was fasting, exercising, proper diet. And I really prepared my body to learn these practices. And that's something I would highly recommend that you all prepare when you endeavor to learn these practices. Now, the Taoists from China viewed sexuality as important to our overall well-being, just as important as nutrition and exercise. Orgasm was practiced not as a release, but rather as a large energy resource. And this would probably be a second thing that I want you to understand, that when we start to study from a Taoist perspective, we are beginning to access and activate orgasm, not necessarily for its end or its release of energy, but actually for its building up, generating, and actually storing within the body. And for lack of a better term, in its unreleased state, in its hell state. So that will be a second idea that you want to begin to think about when we learn these practices. This is a quote from Master Mantak Chia. He is who I was trained by, and it says, the most intense stimuli is the desire to express sexual energy. When combined with love, it is the most powerful of all and remains a virtue only to the degree that it is used discriminately with wisdom, compassion, and understanding. With this understanding comes a responsibility to use the extra energy gained in loving and positive ways. This was actually very new to my Western mind. The idea that to learn sexual energy cultivation practices, we actually had to come in contact with this emotion called love. And I'm sure most of you out there have your own concept and idea of what love means, but we're gonna be looking at it from a Taoist perspective. And it's very interesting that we begin to look at it at a Taoist perspective. We begin to see that these practices have a much more profound meaning and understanding in terms of how we begin to exercise them when we bring into its integration sexual energy. A better way to explain this, and this is something I put together, is you might say that there's a yin and yang to sexual energy. You might say that the orgasmic release, or the sexual energy for the goal of pleasure, releases a lot of dopamine in the body, and it's kind of a yang energy. It's actually what nature has created for us to be able to propagate our species. And the yin form of orgasm, you could say, is the genetic bonding hormone. Actually, when a woman gets impregnated, her hormones turn into oxytocin from a dopamine state. They actually begin to go into a bonding state. And it's a more soft, more loving, more nurturing, warm energy. It is the interplay between these two energies that we will find are the essence of what we do with the Taoist practices. There's one other insight I want to give you, and it's given in this drawing. And if you look to the left, it shows what's called a cauldron, or a kettle that's able to hold water. Now, in order to understand this whole meaning, sexual energy from a 5 elements Taoist perspective is considered a water energy, And we'll learn later on that that water energy is associated with the kidneys. But just for now, we'll think of a water energy. And as you know, water goes in a downward direction, in the direction of gravity. And because it's associated with our sexual energy, it's located in our sexual center. Then we have a fire energy, which is from a Taoist perspective, a heart energy. And because it moves upward, as fire does, it affects our emotions and it affects our mind. Now, from a Taoist perspective, this is a very intriguing concept. Taoists believe that death was a process of dehydration. In other words, as we age, our waters, which is our sexual energy, eventually flows out of us and dries us up. And at the same time, our heart energy, or our emotional energy, which is our fire energy, also dries our brain up. So when we see fire escaping from the top and water escaping from the bottom, these are actually common symptoms of aging in older people. We see that they cannot control the flow of their urine, and we see many cases of dementia, Alzheimer's, because the brain is not getting enough nourishing or fluids. Well, one of the reasons why the Taoists looked sexual energy was to basically eliminate or somehow slow down this progress of dehydration. And if you look at what they did with this cauldron, very interesting. In the cauldron, you see the water, which is actually above the fire. The fire is below. Now, if you contrast that with how I've just explained it, they've actually reversed the position of the fire, which was above the water in the human that you see to the right. But the metaphor is when you can switch the fire energy or the love energy or that emotional energy and nourish the sexual energy without extinguishing it, and that's where the cauldron comes in, because the cauldron is able to create a separation between the water putting out the fire or the fire evaporating the water. And what happens in that cauldron as this water heats up, it turns into a steam. And that steam begins to rise up to a particular distance where it is no longer affected by that heat, and it begins to fall right back into the cauldron or into the water. So we have this idea or this metaphor of this circulation of sexual energy. We're circulating it by heating it up with the emotional energy, having it evaporate at a certain distance away from the fire to where it reaches again a point of condensation, gets heavy, and falls right back into the cauldron. So this idea of recycling sexual energy is a major theme when it comes to sexual energy cultivation. Another major theme in the sexual energy cultivation practices in Taoism, and one in which you will not find in the tantric practices whatsoever, and one of the reasons why I gravitated more toward the Taoist practices was because we have not only the expression of sexual energy, but also the return of sexual energy back to the body to store that energy, and the necessary grounding in order for that entire process to happen. And it's that word called grounding that we see in the Taoist practices stronger than any sexual cultivation practice that exists today. So this idea of storing sexual energy we'll be talking about a little bit later. We'll be learning how and talking about how we store this sexual energy in the bones, and there's a reason why we store it in the bones, and in the major organs in the body. We actually store it in those parts of our body which are designed to store energy and which are also vital parts of our internal body for health and longevity. Now, one of the earliest books that Master Chia wrote, I'm going to show you two of them. And when you take our course that is going to begin on September 18th, you can look at that at Sexy Spirits that Friday. You will get a free copy of this book in a PDF form. Whether we have the male form, Cultivating Male Sexual Energy, and the female form, Cultivating Female Sexual Energy. And these are actually the two foundational books that we use for our training for that weekend that we will be hosting. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, again, the idea of longevity, but how it relates to the man's orgasm. Because the man's orgasm necessarily is accompanied by ejaculation. And when a woman has orgasm, she does not necessarily throw her egg out of her body with every orgasm she has. Whereas the man, when he orgasms, he ejects out of his body sperm. It's just the way nature created. Nature created us so that the man ejects his sperm into the woman, the egg stays in its location, and the sperm finds its target. So women, as we shall see, lose their sexual energy through their menstrual cycles. So we'll be talking a little bit later about that in another webinar. But for now, I want to cover the men. And according to a study published in the British Medical Journal on Welsh men aged 45 to 59, the more orgasms a man has, the likely he is to live longer. Very interesting, men, isn't it? The biggest difference in men who orgasm frequently was seen in reduced death from coronary heart disease. Now, I want to add one more huge part that the Taoists bring in that perspective. From the Taoist point of view, if men increase their orgasmic energy through controlling ejaculation, by drawing the orgasmic energy up to the brain without losing their sperm, their vitality and longevity will increase. And I just want to cover that first paragraph because this study was done with men in their 40s and 50s. And of course, the more orgasms a man has is likely to live forever. But let me remind you, at that age, orgasms that are accompanied by ejaculation require a long refractory period, a long period to build up more sperm and ejaculate again. Whereas if a man at that age learns how to have several orgasms without the act of ejaculating, he no longer has refractory periods. And this is something I want to really make clear because it's very confusing when men start to embark on the training of non-ejaculatory orgasm. We are really talking about a different sensation and phenomena of orgasm that most men have never experienced unless they've experienced it without ejaculation. And it is something that must be trained because our body, thanks to nature, has fused these two phenomena, the act of orgasm and ejaculation, especially in the man, in order, again, to promote procreation. Any men listening will remember as little boys that you were orgasming through masturbation way before that time that you first ejaculated. So there was a time when you can go back, if you can remember, where all little boys were able to orgasm easily without ejaculating because their body was not yet developed to ejaculate. So it's very important that what we're learning in these practices to go back to that state, where we were little boys able to orgasm and not necessarily ejaculate. Here is a recipe given by the Taoist practice and Taoist monks years ago. And it basically says that if you're in your 20s, you can actually be safely able to ejaculate 4 days out of every week. When you hit your 30s, you can safely ejaculate once every 8 days. When you are a man in your 40s, you can safely ejaculate once every 16 days. Men who are in their 50s can ejaculate once every 21 days safely, and men who are 60 completely close off semen and do not leak again. So the Taoists really believed that after the age of 60, any further ejaculation should cease to exist. But I want to say that continual orgasm was vital, necessary, and paramount for men over their 60 to continue in their state of health and in their state of well-being. So this is something I really want to make clear because it is something so misunderstood. The power lock is one of the practices that we will be learning on the men's sexual energy cultivation workshop that I will be teaching in September in New York City, September 18th, 19th, and 20th. What I wanted to point out with this is a drawing done by an artist who was a certified Taoist instructor. It says, men must balance this sexual work with what is called the inner smile, 6 healing sounds, and microcosmic orbit, along with iron shirt qigong. Now, the reason why I wanted you to see this is because these are words I'm going to introduce very briefly today so that you can get some insight into how you will learn these practices, because it is not just a physical training that you give your sexual organs. It requires an emotional training along with a mental training, along with a physical training related to your tendons, your muscles, your bones, which we will go over through. We went over this last time, and this is what's called the valley orgasm. And this is the idea that orgasm, when we When we build up orgasm, and instead of making that peak experience, when we build it in continuous valleys where we can let the orgasm slightly recede and then build it up, you can see from that arrow to the left that we move up the spine. We move from the genitals to the brain through the spine. And I just want to point out that that is a totally opposite direction from where ejaculation normally goes. Ejaculation for the man will normally go from the testes out through the prostate and ejected through the penis into the woman or down toward the earth. So it's in a totally different direction. And as you can see way at the top of this graph, we learn how to finish our lovemaking in a state of peak. In other words, we learn how to easily stay in that state. And just from personal experience, I can tell you, once you reach this level or this state of orgasm in your body, it is not a state of frustration or of energy that has to be released. It is actually, gosh, what I would imagine a woman must go through when she feels an orgasmic state in her body. A fullness that you do not want to let go of. You want to keep contained in your body. And the more you reach this state, the more your mind by itself is able to control your ejaculation. Because when your mind gets to experience this state, it begins to go more in this direction as opposed to the direction of depleting your energy. So, as you shall see, I wanted to point this out because this valley orgasm moves in centers that begin in our sexual center at the pelvis all the way up to the brain. And just want to point out that they have pointed these areas that correspond very coincidentally with the tantric chakras, And when we refer to these points in the Taoist perspective, we don't really look at them as chakras, which are also known as energy centers or wheels. The Chinese had a different concept of sexual energy. Okay, and we're going to get to how they looked at it in relationship to those chakras. And the first thing I want you to really get a hold of, something that might seem simple, but it's not, is that when we look at sexual energy, we are looking at sexual energy in two ways. One, as an energy that is created and that we are born with in order to procreate as a species. The other energy is the energy that we talked about when we talked about the oxytocin or the yin and yang. It's that energy that brings us together in intimacy and love. But when we talk about sexual energy, we can even get more specific in that. The sexual energy from a Taoist perspective is actually, from the man's perspective, the bioelectromagnetic energy of the sperm. In other words, if we have 100 million sperm at any one time in our testicles, and we put those sperm in a state of activation, we have this actual physical movement of the sperm wiggling at, I believe it's 8,000 megacycles per second. That's a lot of energy. In the women, the corresponding energy is that energy called the ilia, which are little hair-like energy fibers that surround the egg that actually call out. They act as a beacon. They act as like a honing device for the sperm to find its mark. So here is what we were talking about when we talk about sexual energy. That is why when we specifically start to narrow down our sexual energy, men concentrate on the sperm energy and women concentrate on the eggs. It's a very different way of looking at our sexual energy. The Taoists looked at the very first cell that originated who we are today as that cell from orgasmic energy, the union of that sperm and egg, that once there was a stage of fertilization, there then entered a state of mitosis where the sperm or the fertilized egg began to divide and separate into identical DNA structures and went on to create 2 identical cells. And from a Taoist perspective, and actually from a biological perspective, this process of cell division is happening as we speak. In other words, as we speak and listen, our cells are dividing and dying on a continuous basis, and all of this started from the original cell. So you could say that every cell is carrying the original source or the original sexual orgasm that our parents have. Hope that doesn't freak you out, but think about that. It begins to make a lot of sense if you think about how we all evolved from a cell that was first impregnated through the egg by a sperm. We're going to go now to talking about the microcosmic orbit. And again, we're going to go to these in more detail on our Friday seminar that we're going to have for men and women on the 18th. And you're really going to learn these practices so that you can take them home and practice. And what I want you to notice is that in the Taoist perspective, we're going to be learning how to circulate sexual energy. And as you can see, we have a red fire symbol going upwards the spine, around the crown. And then we have a blue symbol representing water. So again, I want to bring your attention to this constant theme of fire and water. In the Taoist practices, we call this Kan and Li. Kan meaning water, and Li meaning fire. Kan and Li. And Kan and Li is very suspiciously sounding like Kundalini. Kundalini. So we have the same concept from an Indian perspective or a tantric perspective. Kunda meaning stillness, like water. Lini meaning serpent, moving upward. So we have again this theme. The difference from the Kundalini concept to the Taoist perspective is that in the Taoist perspective, we have this constant concept of circulation and recycling through the body. So if you look at the middle core from the center to the top, that is how you'll see the Kundalini express as 2 serpents coming from the sexual center to the brain. For the Taoist perspective, that is only the beginning. That core is first set up, and then after it's set up, we have this circulation of energy around that core. So from a Taoist perspective, we learn how to make a connection from our sexual center. For the female, on the left, you can see that area is around her cervix and around the G-spot as well, where the energy, it's considered the sexual center for the women energy. For the man, that sexual energy center is the prostate. And the goal of both men and women is to connect their sexual center with the center of their brain. And that center is in the hypothalamus. And it's very interesting that in the hypothalamus, we have the location of the pituitary gland. In the Taoist perspective, we call this the crystal palace. Now, something I want you to be aware of. When the hypothalamus, through intense neurological stimulation, is activated through sexual energy, it induces the pituitary gland to begin to secrete what are called gonadotropins, which are on the other, which are actually hormones that we have an abundance of in our youth. And this is somehow what the Taoists were aware of, that if they could stimulate the hypothalamus with a lot of sexual energy by bringing it up to the brain, they would activate the pituitary gland, which would begin to secrete all these gonadotropins, and it would also stimulate the entire endocrine system, because as you know, the pituitary gland is the master gland. So from a Taoist perspective, we have the conscious activation of our entire endocrine system. And if you remember, I told you those chakra points. Well, the Taoists look at our endocrine system, and the vessels where our endocrine systems are located are very coincidentally close and aligned to where Indians or the tantric system have placed their chakras. Now, one of the reasons why I was very much more attracted to the Taoist perspective is because science and biology of the body, maybe being a dancer, I was more drawn, and also being somewhat of a math and science major, I was just drawn more to the scientific portion of the Taoist practices. I was intrigued that they had looked at the body's health and the actual organs and the actual endocrine system and how these were hormone producing systems in our body, as well as vital organs and how they related. So that is one of the biggest distinctions between Taoist and Tantric practices, and really why I'm so attracted. When you come to my class on the Friday, the 18th, to learn these practices, the men will be learning testicle breathing to activate this center. They'll be learning how to activate through the testicle breathing. For the women, it will be the ovarian breathing. So we have this method of ovarian breathing and testicle breathing to activate the sexual center with the brain. And the idea is that you create this positive and negative charge. For the men, the positive charge is in the sexual center, the negative charge is in the brain, and for the women, that's reversed. The positive charge is in the brain and the negative charge is in her sexual center. But in both cases, we try to activate first and foremost those positive and negative polarities before we begin to now move and orbit around that pole. So you'll be learning testicle and ovarian breathing and how that will begin the foundation of our microcosmic orbit. Once we begin this recycling of energy, we then learn how to bring our sexual energy and direct it for storage purposes. And one of the first places we storage is in 5 major organs. Now I'm going to diverge very quickly here and talk a little bit about why these 5 major organs are important: the lungs, the kidneys, the heart, liver, and spleen. They're all based on the 5-element system. Now, the Ayurvedic system basically has the 5-element system as well, but they relate them more to doshas, and we relate them more to our seasons and into the 5 organs that we're going to talk about. But the classical 5-element theory asserts that every human being is born with or develops early in life with imbalances in the natural functioning of these 5 elements. So what I want to say is that very few of us are born with all of these elements in perfection. I would say the people that are born near perfection are kind of the superstars, like Michael Jordan, or the famous kind of the famous athletes, or the famous thinkers, or the famous people that have had these elements balanced kind of just by birth, just by chance. But not most of us, for the most part, have 1 or 2 of these elements always out of balance. And the Chinese medicine system is a very simple way of just, number 1, discovering which element you were imbalanced with, and then finding those resources outside of yourself to handle those balances. It's actually a brilliant system. So we have fire, earth, metal, and water. And we have seasons that correspond. Metal corresponding to the fall season, which we are soon going into. We have just exited the earth season, which was the Indian summer. Fall will be going into the water element, or the winter season. And winter will eventually come back to spring, which is the wood. And then spring will go into summer. Now, each of these elements also have corresponding organs. The metal being the lungs, so we're going into the lung season. Now you'll notice that in the fall season, depression is a little bit easier for the average person. We see the leaves falling. We see kind of death, hibernating. We tend to get lung issues. Colds happen. We tend to get a lot of bronchial issues during this time. So it's good to fortify your lungs. when the fall season comes. The water season, again, we talked about the sexual energy, is associated with winter, and it's associated with the kidneys. So it's very important to understand that anything that relates to kidneys has to do with sexual energy. And then we have the wood energy, or the spring, which is related to liver. Usually in liver, we want to detoxify in the spring. And then, of course, then we have the fire, which is related to the heart. And then the earth, which is the spleen, and the pancreas, or the stomach, or the kind of the center of digestive system of our body. So these are the 5 elements. And you don't really have to know a lot about these, but I can assure you that you will be getting a great foundation about these 5 elements. Because once I learned these, and I only learned these because I was after the sexual cultivation practices, once you learn these 5 elements, you begin to become very intuitive about your own health. You begin to see where your weaknesses are and how to fortify them. And it's actually a brilliant, what I would call, intuitive science. Another thing I want to point out is that all of these organs have corresponding points. I'm sure if you've had foot reflexology, we have those 5 corresponding points on our feet. We have them on our hands. We have them on our face, but we also have them on our genitals. So if you look very closely, you'll see that the penis has lung and heart points, very specific locations, very locations for the spleen, stomach, and pancreas point, very specific location for the liver, and large, the kidney. And if you look at the vagina for the women, you can see that the heart and lung is more closely at the location of the cervix. Then moving down, we have the spleen and pancreas location, the liver, the kidney. So it's very interesting that when we do foot reflexology, that we can actually massage those points in our feet and activate and stimulate those imbalanced parts of our 5 major organs. Well, we can do the same thing with our sexual organs. When we learn to understand these corresponding parts with our sexual organs, we're able to actually initiate health and stimulation to those parts of our organs that are either imbalanced with either excess or not enough energy in them. So that's just something I want to put out there. And again, very intriguing concept. When these organs go out of balance, they also have emotions attached to them. So for instance, if the heart is overheated, we have an emotion of hate and cruelty. So hate, cruelty, and impatience are considered emotions that are out of balance. Okay, so look at the lungs. When the lungs are weak, we tend to easily get into sadness and depression. Or you could say that when you feel sad and depressed, you might want to look at a lung issue that might be happening. Worry and anxiety can indicate a stomach or spleen issue. Fear, when fear happens, it might indicate a kidney issue. And anger can also be related to liver issues. So why I want to mention this is because for the first time, we have corresponding emotions that we can attach to these elements. And remember, if you remember from the beginning of this webinar, you cannot achieve sexual energy mastery if you without integrating your emotional intelligence as well. And this is the vehicle. This is how we do it. We learn the emotions that are in our organs, and we begin to connect to our organs with our sexual energy through those emotions, thereby enhancing the energy of those emotions. So I know that might sound a little confusing to you right now, but for me, it was an exciting practice to learn, because here is where sexual energy really meets health and longevity. So as you can see, we have happy organs. When we have happy organs, our energy levels increase, we have calmness in the body, we have relaxation, and we have energy charges up the brain. Why do we want energy up our brain? Well, as you remember, fire dehydrates our brain as we age. But if we always have lots of sexual energy, which is a water energy, irrigating our brain all the time, we have enough fluids that our brain does not dry up. Pretty amazing. I want to just mention one more aspect of the practice, and then we'll end it pretty soon, because I know this is a lot. But these are things you're all going to learn. And I have to tell you that when I learned these practices, and we're looking now at the inner smile, okay, there's this idea of the inner smile. And just want to bring to your attention that if you've ever looked at any Buddha, picture of a Buddha or a painting or a statue or sculpture, you'll always notice that there's this kind of inner smile, that it's not a frown and it's not a blank look. There's almost like a smile that's happening. And that is a very profound training and practice that comes with learning. It's actually, in my opinion, what led me to bind with myself. In other words, I was able for the first time to create self-love, this state of self-love. And as you know, in the Western world, there's a lot of people that don't love themselves. And a lot of people that go to counselors or mentors or, psychiatrists or psychologists to help them to understand. Well, from a Taoist perspective, we learn to develop that self-love through a simple smile. And we smile to our organs. We develop this relationship with those 5 major organs. It's actually one of the most brilliant practices I've ever seen in my life. And I would have to say that when you learn these practices, what is beautiful about the Tao is you learn how to become your own psychologist or mentor or coach. You learn how to become your own priest with your spiritual practice. You learn how to become your own doctor with your attention to your health and understanding it. And that's what I really love about the Taoist practice. You become truly empowered to be your own doctor, your own priest or priestess, and your own mentor, coach, or psychologist. The last thing we're going to talk about is the importance of storing this sexual energy in our bones. Now, when I was first introduced to this, it was kind of unusual that we would learn how to store in our bones. But I want you to look at these pictures here. Okay, now on the right, you'll see that we have bone marrow, which is very full. It has a lot of marrow in the middle. And we have a lot of marrow as babies all the way up. But what happens is as we age, this marrow, this fat begins to, again, dehydrate, dry. And if you look as we move to the left, I'm sorry, I said it wrong. It's not that it's cleared with fat, it's just cleared with marrow. But as we age, this bone marrow turns yellow, it begins to actually dry up with fat. It no longer has the healthy marrow. And as soon as it begins to lose its function, we no longer have the reproduction of new red blood cells. Think about that. Our body reproduces red blood every 7 days. Brand new, actually, I think it's every 7 hours. Brand new red blood cells. Well, where does this production come from? It comes from our bone marrow. But if our bone marrow is dried up and no longer producing those red blood cells, guess what? We begin to recycle old blood. It's like driving a car with no longer having oil changes. And the Taoists were brilliant in understanding that. So one of the most important places that you want to be able to bring sexual energy, which is a water energy, which keeps your bones moist and keeps them invigorated with a sexual electromagnetic energy, means that your bones will stay youthful and continue to produce red blood cells. So you will be learning Qigong and bone marrow Nigong, which will help you understand these practices so that when you build up sexual energy, you know where to put it in your body. Now, that is kind of the webinar for tonight, and I hope this has given you some insight into what we will be learning on September 18th for the men and women. That Friday will be for men and women. It'll be a 3-hour seminar. You will be getting the foundational practices. You'll be getting enough to take home. You will not necessarily be getting the actual sexual organ practices because we will not have time. And you need this foundation. You need this foundation first and foremost. But for the men, and the only reason why we are focusing on the men is because I am far more trained to teach men these practices than I am women practices. I don't have women's machinery. So we will be having a woman teach the women's practices. So I'm very happy to teach the men's practices. That will be on the 19th and 20th. And on the 20th, we do have Charlie Glickman from California, the author of The Ultimate Guide to Prostate Health, who will be here. And that will be on Sunday from 11 to 2. And that will be for both men and women. And if you weren't here in the beginning, let me just bring you back and point out that you can go to sexyspirits.com. Let me bring that screen up for you again. It's right here. And when you go to Sexy Spirits, if you're not already a member, make sure that you go to the bottom and become a member. It's free. You get all our mailings. And go to view all events, where you will see all of the events. Here's our webinar that we're doing today. We actually have one more next week. And you can see the class that we're offering for women. We're actually offering a discount if you register before September 10th. So you have 11 days to register. You'll actually get a substantial discount if you register for that class, as well as the men, if they choose to register for the workshop. I believe we have a discount there. Yeah, we have a discount there for you. Say $50 for that whole weekend. That price for the men includes the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 9 to 5. It's going to be all day Saturday, all day Sunday, as well as the Friday night seminar. So I hope you have gotten something out of this. Your comments would be great if you could put them in the chat area. And we look forward to seeing you next Sunday for our next seminar. I'd like to bid you all a good evening and thank you for joining us tonight. If you have any comments that you'd like to put in the chat area, please do so now. Thanks again.